The house was empty, yet there were wet footprints leading up the stairs.
Part 14 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 14. Captain Samuel Goodyear, Matthew Mahoney, and Charles White. Executed for the murder of Sir John D. Goodyear, Baronet. This atrocious murder was committed through the instrumentality of Captain Samuel Goodyear upon his brother Sir John Dinley Goodyear, on board a man of war, of which the former was captain. Sir John, it appears, was possessed of an estate of £3,000 per annum, situated at Evesham in Worcestershire, which he derived from his father Sir Edward, and his brother, who is the subject of this sketch, having been bred to the sea, was advanced to the rank of captain of one of His Majesty's vessels of war. Sir John, having no children, very sanguine expectations were entertained by his brother that he should inherit his property, but upon his discovering that he had made a will in favour of their sister's children, his rage knew no bounds, and he determined upon a most diabolical revenge for the supposed injury which he had received. The vessel of which Captain Goodyear had the command, it appears, was employed as one of the Channel cruisers, and in the month of January 1741 it was lying at Bristol. At this period it happened that Sir John Goodyear was in that city, transacting some business with Mr. Smith, an attorney, and his brother, having been made acquainted with the circumstance, fixed upon this as a proper time to put his plan into execution. Throwing himself into Mr. Smith's way, he assured him that a perfect reconciliation had taken place between them, notwithstanding a misunderstanding which was known to have existed, and after some conversation, learning that his brother was going to dine with that gentleman on a certain day, he procured himself to be invited to meet him. Having determined upon this as a favourable opportunity to carry his design into execution, on his going ashore he carried with him some of his seamen, to whom he gave instructions that Sir John, being insane, he desired to procure him to be carried on board his ship, in order that he might be conveyed to a place of safety. The men, therefore, having been regaled during the evening at a neighbouring public house, as night approached placed themselves in readiness to obey the orders which they had received, and Sir John making his appearance, they seized him and forcibly put him into a boat, in which they directly rowed him to the vessel. The protestations made by the captain that it was only a deserter whom they were apprehending silenced all inquiry from the crowd which had assembled on their perceiving this outrage, and the unfortunate baronet was secured without an effort being made to procure his release, or to save him from the bloody fate which awaited him. As soon as the devoted victim was in the boat, he said to his brother, "I know you have an intention to murder me, and if you are ready to do it, let me beg that it may be done here, without giving yourself the trouble to take me on board." To which the captain said, "No, brother, I am going to prevent your rotting on land, but however, I would have you make your peace with God this night." Sir John having reached the vessel, he called to the seamen for help, but they, having learned their captain's commands from their fellows, did not offer to render the slightest aid, and the wretched gentleman was immediately conveyed to the purser's cabin. White and Maloney were selected by their captain as the performers in the dreadful scene which was now to be enacted. While Goodyear stood at the entrance of the cabin, guarding it with a drawn sword, his two assistants entered it and approached their victim. He cried aloud for mercy, offering all he possessed as a return if they would spare his life, but regardless of his prayers, they deliberately proceeded to the completion of their sanguinary intentions. Seizing him by the shoulders, they threw him on the deck, and there, with a handkerchief which they took from his pocket, they attempted to strangle him. Finding that their efforts were unavailing, they procured a cord from their guilty commander, with which they speedily dispatched him. White kneeling on his breast and holding his hands, while Mahoney fixed the cord round his throat and tightened it until strangulation had taken place. They then accompanied their captain to his cabin, who gave them the sum agreed upon for their services, and bid them seek their safety in flight. The murder was soon made known on shore, through the instrumentality of the crew of the vessel, and the circumstance having come to the knowledge of Mr. Smith, the attorney, he procured a warrant to be issued, upon which the officers of the city proceeded on board the ship. They found that the captain had there been already put under arrest by the lieutenant and sailing master, and he was immediately conveyed in custody to the prison of the town. It was not long before Mahoney and White were also secured, and the prisoners being brought to trial at Bristol on the 26th of March 1741, they were convicted on the clearest evidence, and sentenced to death. Captain Goodyear's time after conviction was spent chiefly in writing letters to persons of rank, to make interest to save his life, and his wife and daughter presented a petition to the king, but all endeavours of this kind proving ineffectual, he employed a man to hire some colliers to rescue him on his way to the fatal tree. His efforts in this respect, however, were as unavailing as those which he had made to procure a mitigation of his punishment, for, the circumstance having been made known to the sheriff, he took such steps as were deemed expedient and necessary to prevent the success of the project. The wretched companions in guilt of the captain exhibited the greatest hardihood, and when the jailers were employed in putting on their irons, they declared that they had no fear of death. Captain Goodyear's wife and daughter, dressed in deep mourning, took a solemn leave of him on the day before his death, and he went in a mourning coach to the place of execution, to which his accomplices were conveyed in a cart. They were hanged near the Hot Wells, Bristol, on the 20th of April 1741, within view of the place where the ship lay when the murder was committed. John Bodkin, Dominic Bodkin, and others, executed for murder. Oliver Bodkin, Esquire, was a gentleman who possessed a good estate near Tuam in Ireland. He had 2 sons by 2 wives. The elder son, named John, to whom this narrative chiefly relates, was sent to Dublin to study the law, and the younger, who was about 7 years of age, remained at home with his parents. The young student lived in a very dissipated manner in Dublin, and soon quitting his studies, came and resided near his father's place of abode. The father allowed him a certain annual sum for his support, but as he lived beyond his allowance, he demanded farther assistance. The father, however, refusing to accede to his wishes, he determined upon a horrible revenge, and included his mother-in-law in his proposed scheme of vengeance, as he imagined that she had induced his father to refuse him any further aid. Having engaged his cousin, Dominic Bodkin, his father's shepherd, John Hogan, and another ruffian of the name of Burke, to assist him in the intended murders, they went to the house of Mr. Bodkin, senior, whose household consisted of 4 men and 3 women servants, exclusive of Mrs. Bodkin and the younger son, and a gentleman named Lynch, who was at that time on a visit there. They found all the members of the family at supper on their arrival, and having murdered them, they went into the kitchen, where they killed 3 servant maids, and finding the men in different parts of the house, they also sacrificed them to their brutal and unprovoked rage. The murder of 11 persons being thus perpetrated, they quitted the fatal spot, and when some persons from Tuam came the next morning to speak with Mr. Bodkin on business, they found the house open, and beheld the dead body of Mr. Lynch, near which lay that of Mrs. Bodkin, hacked and mangled in a shocking manner, and at a small distance her husband with his throat cut, and the child lying dead across his breast. The throats of the maid servants in the kitchen were all cut, and the men servants in another room were also found murdered. The assassins had even been so wanton in their cruelties as to kill all the dogs and cats in the house. The neighbours being alarmed by such a singular instance of barbarity, a suspicion fell on John Bodkin, who, being taken into custody, confessed all the tragical circumstances above mentioned, and impeached his accomplices, on which the other offenders were taken into custody, and all of them were committed to the jail of Tuam. The shepherd then confessed that he had murdered 2, but that thinking to preserve the boy, to whom he had been foster-father, he besmeared him with blood, and laid him near his father. Dominic, perceiving him alive, killed him, and he afterwards murdered 5 more. John Bodkin owned that he and Burke killed the remainder, that he had formerly attempted to poison his mother-in-law, and that he was concerned with his first cousins, John Bodkin, then living, and Frank Bodkin, then lately dead, in strangling Dominic Bodkin, their brother, heir of the late Councillor John Bodkin of Carrowbeg, to an estate of £900 a year. When they were brought to trial, John Bodkin, the parricide, Dominic Bodkin and John Hogan pleaded guilty, and they were all condemned and executed at Tuam on the 26th of March 1742. The head of the shepherd was fixed on Tuam Market House, and the bodies of the others gibbeted within sight of the house where the murders had been committed. Upon the confession of John, the cousin of the same name was apprehended for the murder of his elder brother, Dominic Bodkin, and accused of sitting on his mouth and breast till he was suffocated. He was taken in a moss or turf bog near Tuam, covered over with straw, and disguised in an old hat and peasant's clothes, for which he had given his own laced coat and hat. Being examined before Lord Athenry, he said that he had fled for fear of being loaded with irons in a jail, and denied having any hand in his brother Dominic's death, affirming that he had died of a surfeit, as had been reported. He was present at the execution of his relations, but confessed nothing, and thus, there being no positive proof against him, he escaped justice. A case in which more cold-blooded cruelty has been displayed than in this has seldom fallen under our notice. The murder of an indulgent parent must be insufferably shocking to every humane mind, but when we consider, as in the present instance, what a variety of unprovoked murders were added to the first, the mind is lost in astonishment at the baseness, the barbarity, the worse than savage degeneracy of those beings who could perpetrate such horrid deeds. Jonathan Bradford, executed for murder. The details of this case reach us in a very abridged form, and we have been unable to collect any information on which any reliance can be placed beyond that which is afforded us by the ordinary channels. It would appear that Jonathan Bradford kept an inn in the city of Oxford. A gentleman, Mr. Hayes, attended by a manservant, put up one evening at Bradford's house, and in the night, the former being found murdered in his bed, the landlord was apprehended on suspicion of having committed the barbarous and inhospitable crime. The evidence given against him was to the following effect. Two gentlemen who had supped with Mr. Hayes, and who retired at the same time to their respective chambers, being alarmed in the night with a noise in his room, and soon hearing groans as of a wounded man, got up in order to discover the cause, and found their landlord with a dark lantern and a knife in his hand, standing in a state of astonishment and horror over his dying guest, who almost instantly expired. On this evidence, apparently conclusive, the jury convicted Bradford, and he was executed. But the fate of this man may serve as a lesson to jurymen to be extremely guarded in receiving circumstantial evidence. The facts attending the above dreadful tragedy were not fully brought to light until the deathbed confession of the real murderer, a time when we must all endeavour to make our peace with God. Mr. Hayes was a man of considerable property, and greatly respected. He had about him, when his sad destiny led him under the roof of Bradford, a considerable sum of money, and the landlord, knowing this, determined to murder and rob him. For this horrid purpose he proceeded with a dark lantern and carving knife, intending to cut the throat of his guest. Part 15 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 15. The Earl of Kilmarnock and Lord Balmerino, beheaded for high treason. A short account of the circumstances attending the rebellion of 1715 having been given in this work, some notice will, doubtless, be expected of the second transaction of the same character, and with the same object, which occurred in the year 1745. It appears that the Pretender having gained the protection of France, and the French also having their own interests to serve, it was determined that a second attempt to restore the Stuarts to the throne of England should be made by the descent of a body of men upon Scotland, where it was conjectured numbers would render assistance, which was eventually to march forward towards London and expel the reigning monarch. The design was evidently known to the government, from an allusion made to the circumstance by the King in his speech from the throne on the 2nd of May 1745, but the first notice which the British public had of the proceedings of the Pretender was from a paragraph in the General Evening Post, which said, "The Pretender's eldest son put to sea, July 14th, from France, in an armed ship of 60 guns, provided with a large quantity of warlike stores, together with a frigate of 30 guns and a number of smaller armed vessels, in order to land in Scotland, where he expected to find 20,000 men in arms to make good his father's pretensions to the crown of Great Britain. He was to be joined by 5 ships of the line from Brest, and 4,500 Spaniards were embarking at Ferrol. The government, it appears, was not inactive on this occasion, and proper instructions were given to such of the king's vessels as were cruising in the Channel to prevent the approach of any ships which might be supposed to carry the leader of this rebellious attempt. The young Pretender, followed by about 50 Scotch and Irish adventurers, meanwhile came incognito through Normandy, and embarked on board a ship of war of 18 guns, which was joined off Belle-Isle by the Elizabeth and other ships. They intended to have sailed northwards and to have landed in Scotland, but on the 20th they came up with an English fleet of merchant vessels under convoy of the Lion man-of-war of 58 guns, commanded by Captain Brett, who immediately bore down upon the French line of battle ship, which he engaged within pistol shot 5 hours, being constantly annoyed by the smaller ships of the enemy. The rigging of the Lion was cut to pieces, her mizzen-mast, mizzen-topmast, main-yard and fore-topsail were shot away, all her lower masts and topmasts shot through in many places, so that she lay muzzled on the sea, and could do nothing with her sails. Thus situated, the French ships sheered off, and the Lion could make no effort to follow them. Captain Brett had 45 men killed, himself, all his lieutenants, the master, several midshipmen, and 107 foremast men wounded. His principal antagonist, the Elizabeth, with difficulty got back to Brest, quite disabled, and had 64 men killed, 139 dangerously wounded, and a number more slightly injured. She had on board £400,000 sterling, and arms and ammunition for several thousand men. The friends of the Stuart cause in Scotland were in the meantime as active as their opponents, and committed many irregularities for the purpose of supplying their ranks with a sufficient number of soldiers, and being thus prepared, anxiously expected the arrival of their prince. The latter found means to join his supporters by a small vessel, in which he quitted the French coast, and eluding the vigilance of the English cruisers, he landed on the Isle of Skye, opposite to Lochaber, in the county of Inverness. After a lapse of about 3 weeks, he appeared at the head of a body of 2,000 men, under a standard bearing the motto Tandem Triumphans, at length triumphant, and marching his army to Fort William, he there published a manifesto signed by his father at Rome, containing many promises to those who would adhere to his cause, among which were undertakings that he would procure the dissolution of the union of the two kingdoms, and the payment of the national debt. The country people flocked in great numbers to his standard, and the mob, by which he was followed, soon assumed the appearance, in numbers at least, of an army. Their first attempt in arms, in opposition to 2 companies of foot of the St. Clair and Murray's regiments, was successful, the soldiers being far inferior in numbers, and the rebels immediately marched upon Perth, and having taken possession of that place, the Pretender issued his orders for all persons who held public money to pay it into the hands of his secretary. Dundee and Dunblane were successively seized by his soldiers, and at length on the 14th of September the Pretender proceeded through the Royal Park and took possession of Holyrood House. The money in the Bank of Edinburgh and the records in the public offices were now removed to the castle for security, and the gates of the city were kept fast during the whole day, but 500 of the rebels, having concealed themselves in the suburbs, took an opportunity at 4 o'clock in the morning to follow a coach which was going in, and seizing the gate called the Netherbow, they maintained their ground while the main body reached the centre of the city and formed themselves in the Parliament Close. Thus possessed of the Scottish capital, they seized 2,000 stand of arms, and on the following day marched to oppose the royal army under the command of General Cope. The two armies coming in sight of each other near Preston Pans on the evening of the 20th, Colonel Gardiner earnestly recommended it to the general to attack his opponents during the night, but, deaf to this advice, he kept the men under arms till morning, though they were already greatly harassed. At 5 in the morning the rebels made a furious attack on the royal army, which was thrown into unspeakable confusion by 2 regiments of dragoons falling back on the foot. Colonel Gardiner, with 500 foot, behaved with uncommon valour, and covered the retreat of those who fled, but the colonel receiving a mortal wound, the rebels made prisoners of nearly all the rest of the king's troops. The loss thus sustained by the royal army was 300 killed, 450 wounded, 520 taken prisoners, total 1,270, while the rebels only lost 50 men in all. Flushed with this partial victory, the rebels returned to Edinburgh to make an attack upon the castle, and attempted to throw up an entrenchment upon the hill, but notice having been given to the inhabitants to retire, the battery was attacked by the guns from above, the works destroyed, and 30 of the assailants killed, besides 3 of the inhabitants who rashly ventured near the spot. The rebel army remained during 7 weeks in this city, and many noblemen and gentlemen with their followers having joined it, a force of more than 10,000 men was at length mustered. In November they marched upon Carlisle, and after some resistance had been shown, it was surrendered, and the insurgents then forced their way into Manchester, where a regiment, chiefly formed of Roman Catholics, was raised. But now such decisive measures were taken as put an end very shortly to the insurrection. The Duke of Cumberland was at the time in Flanders with the army, but being sent for thence, he soon arrived to take the command of the royal forces. About the time he reached London, the rebels had advanced as far as Derby, but his Royal Highness lost no time in travelling into Staffordshire, where he collected all the force he could to stop their farther inroads into the kingdom. Liverpool had not been behind London in spirit and loyalty. The inhabitants contributed largely in assisting the royal army at this inclement season with warm clothing, and raised several companies of armed men, which were called the Royal Liverpool Blues. Some of the advance parties of rebels having appeared in sight of the town, every preparation was made to resist them, but finding at length that the Pretender bent his march by another route for Manchester, the Liverpool Blues marched in order to destroy the bridges, and thereby impede their progress. Notwithstanding these impediments, the rebels crossed the Mersey at different fords, through which the Pretender waded breast high in water. Their numbers could not be accurately ascertained, their march being straggling and unequal, but about 9,000 appeared to be the aggregate. Their train of artillery consisted of 16 field pieces of 3 and 4 pound shot, 2 carriages of gunpowder, a number of covered waggons, and about 100 horses laden with ammunition. Their vanguard consisted of about 200 cavalry, badly mounted, the horses appearing poor and jaded. The Pretender himself constantly marched on foot, at the head of the 2 regiments, one of which was appropriated as his bodyguard. His dress was a light plaid, belted about with a sash of blue silk. He wore a grey wig with a blue bonnet and a white rose in it, and appeared very dejected at this time. His followers were ordinary, except the 2 regiments mentioned, which appeared to have been picked out of the whole. The arms of the others were very indifferent, some had guns, others only pistols, the remainder broadswords and targets. In order to deceive the Duke of Cumberland, all sorts of reports as to the future route of the rebels were sent abroad, but the king's troops were concentrated at Northampton, a spot well suited for the purpose, as it was the road which it was most probable would be taken in the event of the Pretender advancing upon London, which was known to be his real intention. Meanwhile the rebels appeared unconscious of the danger they were bringing upon themselves by delay, and they remained during a considerable time endeavouring to raise recruits. They at length, however, set forward on their march southward, but they had not advanced more than a mile before they halted, held a consultation, wheeled around, and retraced their steps to Derby. Having there seized all the plunder they could lay their hands upon, they passed on, seeking to regain Scotland, where they had learned that their friends had been joined by some French troops. The Duke of Cumberland, in the meantime, being aware of their flight, followed them with all speed, and learning that they had been compelled to halt at Preston from excessive weariness, he redoubled his efforts to come up with them. By forced marches, travelling through ice and snow, he succeeded in reaching Preston in 3 days, but he found that his game had retired about 4 hours before him. The Pretender soon learned that the excesses, of which his men had been guilty in their southward march, were not to go unpunished, and wherever he went he found himself opposed and harassed by the enraged country people, who lost no opportunity of annoying him in his retreat and of seizing the stragglers from his army. At length, however, after repeated forced marches, the Duke of Cumberland came up with his antagonists at Lowther Hall, and the latter, dreading his approach, immediately threw themselves into the village of Clifton, 3 miles from Penrith. They were there attacked most vigorously and successfully by the dragoons, who had dismounted, and in about an hour's time they were driven away from the post which they occupied. They retreated forthwith to Carlisle, which was still in their possession, but the continued advance of the royal troops induced them again to retire, leaving only a garrison to oppose the entry of the Duke into that city. The besieged fired upon their assailants with great fury, but did little execution, and at length, a battery having been raised against them, they sent out a flag of truce, and surrendered upon terms that they should not be put to the sword, but reserved for the king's pleasure, and thus Carlisle was once more taken possession by the troops of his Majesty. The army of rebels made the best of their way now to Glasgow, where they levied contributions, and thence to Stirling, which was in possession of the English, and was commanded by the gallant General Blakeney. The gates could not be defended, and they therefore marched on, and summoned the garrison to surrender, but the veteran commander answered that he would perish in its ruins rather than make terms with rebels. In the river of the town were 2 English men of war, and the rebels, in order to prevent their going farther up, erected a battery, but the ships soon destroyed it, and caused them to retreat a mile, where they erected another, but did little execution. They now prepared for a vigorous attack upon the castle, got some heavy pieces of ordnance across the Forth, erected a battery against it, and called in all their forces. General Blakeney fired upon them, and repeatedly drove them from their works. General Hawley, in aid of his brother general, at the head of such troops as he could form in order of battle, marched to attempt to raise the siege, but the rebels made a desperate attack, and, aided by accident, obtained the advantage. Repeated skirmishes subsequently took place, but at length this system of warfare, so destructive to the general state of the country, was terminated by the decisive victory gained by the Duke of Cumberland at the head of the royal forces at the Battle of Culloden. The Pretender at the head of his army opposed the Duke, and the following, taken from the London Gazette, is the Conqueror's account of the battle. On Tuesday the 15th of April the rebels burnt Fort Augustus, which convinced us of their resolution to stand an engagement with the King's troops. We gave our men a day's halt at Nairn, and on the 16th marched from thence, between 4 and 5, in 4 columns. The 3 lines of foot, reckoning the reserve for 1, were broken into 3 from the right, which made the 3 columns equal, and each of 5 battalions. The artillery and baggage followed the 1st column upon the right, and the cavalry made the 4th column on the left. After we had marched about 8 miles, our advance guard, composed of about 40 of Kingston's, and the Highlanders, led by the Quartermaster General, perceived the rebels at some distance, making a motion towards us on the left, upon which we immediately formed, but finding the rebels were still a good way from us, we put ourselves again upon our march in our former posture, and continued it to within a mile of them, where we formed in the same order as before. After reconnoitring their situation, we found them posted behind some old walls and huts, in a line with Culloden House. As we thought our right was entirely secure, General Hawley and General Bland went to the left with 2 regiments of dragoons, to endeavour to fall upon the right flank of the rebels, and Kingston's horse was ordered to the reserve. The 10 pieces of cannon were disposed, 2 in each of the intervals of the first line, and all our Highlanders, except 140 which were upon the left with General Hawley, and who behaved extremely well, were left to guard the baggage. When we were advanced within 500 yards of the rebels, we found the morass upon our right was ended, which left our right flank quite uncovered to them. His Royal Highness thereupon immediately ordered Kingston's horse from the reserve, and a little squadron of about 60 of Cobhams, which had been patrolling, to cover our flank. We spent about half an hour after that trying which should gain the flank of the other, and His Royal Highness having sent Lord Berry forward within 100 yards of the rebels to reconnoitre something that appeared like a battery to us, they thereupon began firing their cannon, which was extremely ill-pointed and ill-served. Ours answered them, which began their confusion. They then came running on in their wild manner, and upon the right, where His Royal Highness had placed himself, imagining the greatest push would be there, they came down 3 several times within a yard of our men, firing their pistols and brandishing their swords, but the Royals and Pulteney's hardly took their firelocks from their shoulders, so that after those first attempts they made off, and the little squadrons on our right were sent to pursue them. General Hawley had, by the help of our Highlanders, beat down 2 little stone walls, and came in upon the right flank of their second line. As their whole body came down to attack at once, their right somewhat outflanked Burrell's regiment, which was our left, and the greatest part of the little loss we sustained was there. But Bligh's and Semple's, giving a fire upon those who had outflanked Burrell's, soon repulsed them, and the Burrell's regiment, and the left of Monro's, fairly beat them with their bayonets. There was scarce a soldier or officer of Burrell's, and of that part of Monro's which engaged, who did not kill 1 or 2 men each with their bayonets and spontoons. Footnote: the officers' half-pikes. End of footnote. The cavalry which had charged from the right and left met in the centre, except 2 squadrons of dragoons which we missed, and they were gone in pursuit of the runaways. Lord Ancram was ordered to pursue with the horse as far as he could, and did it with so good effect that a very considerable number was killed in the pursuit. As we were on our march to Inverness, and were nearly arrived there, Major General Bland sent the annexed papers, which he received from the French officers and soldiers, surrendering themselves prisoners to His Royal Highness. Major General Bland had also made great slaughter, and took about 50 French officers and soldiers prisoner in his pursuit. By the best calculation that can be made, it is thought the rebels lost 2,000 men upon the field of battle and in the pursuit. We have here 122 French and 326 rebel prisoners. Lieutenant Colonel Howard killed an officer, who appeared to be Lord Strathallan, by the seal and different commissions from the Pretender found in his pocket. It is said that Lord Perth, Lords Nairn, Lochiel, Keppoch, and Appin Stewart are also killed. All their artillery and ammunition were taken, as well as the Pretenders, and all their baggage. There were also 12 collars taken. All the generals, officers, and soldiers did their utmost duty in His Majesty's service, and showed the greatest zeal and bravery on this occasion. The Pretender's son, it is said, lay at Lord Lovat's house at Aird the night after the action. Brigadier Mordaunt is detached with 900 volunteers this morning into the Frasers' country to attack all the rebels he may find there. Lord Sutherland's and Lord Rees' people continue to exert themselves, and have taken upwards of 100 rebels, who were sent for, and there is a great reason to believe Lord Cromarty and his son are also taken. The Monros have killed 50 of the rebels in their flight. As it is not known where the greatest bodies of them are, or which way they have taken in their flight, His Royal Highness has not yet determined which way to march. On the 17th, as His Royal Highness was at dinner, 3 officers and about 16 of Fitzjames' regiment, who were mounted, came and surrendered themselves prisoners. The killed, wounded, and missing of the King's troops amounted to above 300. The French officers will all be sent to Carlisle till His Majesty's pleasure shall be known. The rebels, by their own accounts, made their loss greater by 2,000 men that we have stated it. 4 of their principal ladies are in custody, viz. Lady Ogilvy, Lady Kinloch, Lady Gordon, and the Laird of Mackintosh's wife. Major Grant, the Governor of Inverness, is retaken, and the Generals Hawley, Lord Albemarle, Husk, and Bland have orders to inquire into the reasons for his surrendering of Fort George. Lord Cromarty, Lord MacLeod, his son, with other prisoners, are just brought in from Sutherland by the Hound sloop, which His Royal Highness has sent for them, and they are just now landing. Soon after this affair, several other rebel chiefs were taken into custody, and on the 28th of July 1746, at about 8 o'clock in the morning, the rebel lords were taken from the Tower to Westminster Hall to be tried by their peers. The Earl of Kilmarnock and the Earl of Cromarty pleaded guilty, but Lord Balmerino, having denied the offence imputed to him, 6 witnesses were called, by whom his guilt was clearly established, and a verdict was returned accordingly. On the 1st of August the peers were brought up for judgment, when the Lord High Steward pronounced sentence of death, in terms very like those used in the case of Earl Cowper, after the former rebellion. Great interest being exerted to save the earls, it was hinted to Balmerino that his friends ought to exert themselves on his behalf, to which, with great magnanimity, he only replied, "I am very indifferent about my own fate, but had the two noble earls been my friends, they would have squeezed my name in among theirs." The Countess of Cromarty, who had a very large family of young children, was incessant in her applications for the pardon of her husband, to obtain which she took a very plausible method. She procured herself to be introduced to the late Princess of Wales, attended by her children in mourning, and urged her suit in the most suppliant terms. The princess had at that time several children. Such an argument could scarcely fail to move, and a pardon was granted to Lord Cromarty on the condition that he should never reside north of the River Trent. This condition was literally complied with, and his lordship died in Soho Square in the year 1766. On the 18th of August 1746, at 6 o'clock in the morning, a troop of Life Guards, one of Horse Grenadiers, and 1,000 of the Foot Guards marched from the parade in St. James's Park through the city to Tower Hill to attend the execution of the Earl of Kilmarnock and Lord Balmerino, and being arrived there were posted in lines from the Tower to the scaffold and all round it. About 8 o'clock the Sheriffs of London, with their under-sheriffs and officers, met at the Mitre Tavern in Fenchurch Street, where they breakfasted, and went from thence to the house lately the Transport Office, Tower Hill, where they remained until the necessary preparations for the execution were made. At 11 o'clock they demanded the bodies of the peers of the Constable of the Tower, and they were directly brought forth in procession, followed by mourning coaches and 2 hearses. The lords were conducted into separate apartments in the house, facing the steps of the scaffold, their friends being admitted to see them. The Earl of Kilmarnock was attended by the Reverend Mr. Foster, a dissenting minister, and the Reverend Mr. Hume, a near relation of the Earl of Hume. The chaplain of the Tower and another clergyman of the Church of England accompanied the Lord Balmerino. The latter, on entering the door of the house, hearing several of the spectators ask eagerly, "Which is Lord Balmerino?" answered, smiling, "I am Lord Balmerino, gentlemen, at your service." The parlour and passage of the house, the rails enclosing the way from thence to the scaffold, and the rails about it, were all hung with black at the sheriff's expense. Lord Kilmarnock, in the apartment allotted to him, spent about an hour in his devotions with Mr. Foster, who assisted him with prayer and exhortation, after which Lord Balmerino, pursuant to his request, was admitted to confer with the Earl. After a short conversation relating to some report as to the Pretender's orders at the Battle of Culloden, they separated, the Lord Balmerino saluting the noble Earl with the same high-minded courtesy which had been before remarked in him. The Earl of Kilmarnock then joined in prayer with those around him, and afterwards he took some refreshment. He expressed a wish that Lord Balmerino should go to the scaffold first, but being informed that this was impossible, as he was named first in the warrant, he immediately acquiesced in the arrangement which had been made, and with his friends proceeded to the place of execution. There was an immense crowd collected, and on their seeing him they exhibited the greatest commiseration and pity. The Earl, being struck with the variety of dreadful objects which presented themselves to him at once, exclaimed to Mr. Hume, "This is terrible," but he exhibited no sign of fear, nor did he even change countenance or tremble in his voice. After putting up a short prayer, concluding with a petition for His Majesty King George and the royal family, his lordship embraced and took leave of his friends. The executioner was so affected by the awfulness of the scene that on his asking pardon of the prisoner he burst into tears. The noble Earl, however, bid him take courage, and presenting him with 5 guineas, told him that he would drop his handkerchief as a signal to him to strike. He then proceeded, with the help of his gentlemen, to make ready for the block, by taking off his coat and the bag from his hair, which was then tucked up under a napkin cap. His neck being laid bare, tucking down the collar of his shirt and waistcoat, he kneeled down on a black cushion at the block, and drew his cap over his eyes, and in doing this, as well as in putting up his hair, his hands were observed to shake. Either to support himself, or for a more convenient posture of devotion, he happened to lay both his hands upon the block, which the executioner observing, prayed his lordship to let them fall, lest they should be mangled or break the blow. He was then told that the neck of his waistcoat was in the way, upon which he rose, and with the help of a friend took it off, and the neck being made bare to the shoulders, he kneeled down as before. In the meantime, when all things were ready for the execution, and the black baize which hung over the rails of the scaffold had, by direction of the colonel of the guard, or the sheriffs, been turned up, that the people might see all the circumstances of the execution, in about 2 minutes after he kneeled down, his lordship dropped his handkerchief, and the executioner at once severed his head from his body, except only a small part of the skin, which was immediately divided by a gentle stroke. His head was received in a piece of red baize, and with the body immediately put into the coffin. The scaffold was then cleared from the blood, fresh sawdust strewed, and that no appearance of a former execution might remain, the executioner changed such of his clothes as appeared bloody. While this was doing, the Lord Balmerino, after having solemnly recommended himself to the mercy of the Almighty, conversed cheerfully with his friends, refreshed himself twice with a bit of bread and a glass of wine, and desired the company to drink to him, acquainting them that he had prepared a speech which he should read on the scaffold, and therefore should now say nothing of its contents. The under-sheriff coming into his lordship's apartment to let him know the stage was ready, he prevented him by immediately asking if the affair was over with the Lord Kilmarnock, and being answered, "It is," he inquired how the executioner had performed his office. Upon receiving the account, he said it was well done, and then addressing himself to the company said, "Gentlemen, I shall detain you no longer," and with an easy, unaffected cheerfulness, saluted his friends and hastened to the scaffold, which he mounted with so unconstrained an air as astonished the spectators. His lordship was dressed in his regimentals, a blue coat, turned up with red, trimmed with brass buttons, the same which he wore at the Battle of Culloden. No circumstance in his whole deportment showed the least sign of fear or regret, and he frequently reproved his friends for discovering either upon his account. He walked several times round the scaffold, bowed to the people, went to his coffin, read the inscription, and with a nod said, "It is right." He then examined the block, which he called his pillow of rest. His lordship, putting on his spectacles and taking a paper out of his pocket, read it with an audible voice, but so far from its being filled with passionate invectives, it mentioned his majesty as a prince of the greatest magnanimity and mercy, at the same time that, through erroneous political principles, it denied him a right to the allegiance of his people. Having delivered this paper to the sheriff, he called for the executioner, and on his being about to ask his lordship's pardon, he said, "Friend, you need not ask me forgiveness. The execution of your duty is commendable." Upon this his lordship gave him 3 guineas, saying, "I never was rich. This is all the money I have now. I wish it was more, and I am sorry I can add nothing to it but my coat and waistcoat," which he then took off, together with his neckcloth, and threw them on his coffin, putting on a flannel waistcoat which had been provided for the purpose, and then taking a plaid cap out of his pocket, he put it on his head, saying he died a Scotchman. After kneeling down at the block to adjust his posture and show the executioner the signal for the stroke, which was dropping his arms, he once more gave a farewell look to his friends, and turning round on the crowd, he said, "Perhaps some may think my behaviour too bold, but remember, sir," to a gentleman who stood near him, "that I now declare it is the effect of a confidence in God and a good conscience, and I should dissemble if I showed any signs of fear." Having observed the axe in the executioner's hand as he passed him, he now took it from him, felt the edge, and returning it, clapped the executioner on the shoulder to encourage him. He even took down the collar of his shirt and waistcoat, and showed him where to strike, desiring him to do it resolutely, "for in that," says his lordship, "will consist your kindness." He afterwards went to the side of the stage, and called upon the warder, of whom he inquired which was his hearse, and ordered the man to drive near, which was instantly done. Immediately, without trembling or changing countenance, he again kneeled down at the block, and having with his arms stretched out, said, "O Lord, reward my friends." Part 16 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 16. Matthew Henderson, executed for the murder of his mistress, Lady Dalrymple. This offender was the son of honest parents, and was born at North Berwick in Scotland, where he was educated in the liberal manner customary in that country. At the age of 14 years he was taken into the employment of Sir Hugh Dalrymple, a member of the British Parliament, whom he accompanied to London, and it was while in his service that he was guilty of the murder of his mistress. It appears that at the time at which he committed this offence he was in his 20th year, and having accidentally given offence to his lady by treading on her toe, she rebuked him in no very gentle manner. Offended by the insult which he conceived he had received, he determined to obtain a deep revenge, and seeking an opportunity, during the absence of his master from London, he proceeded to put his intention into execution by murdering his mistress. For this offence he was brought to trial at the Old Bailey on the 22nd of April 1746, when he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to be hanged on the following Monday, the 25th of the same month. On the night before his execution he made a confession of his crime, from which the following particulars are taken. Having called the Almighty to witness the truth of his assertion, he proceeded to enter into a history of his early life, alleging that he had always been well treated by his master and mistress, for whom he entertained the most sincere respect. On the evening of the 25th of March, 1746, all the other servants having quitted the house, he proceeded to bed in the apartment which was appropriated to his use. He had pulled off his shoes, and had tied up his hair with his garter, when suddenly the thought came into his head that he would kill his mistress. He directly went into the kitchen in search of an instrument to effect his object, and he took a small iron cleaver, but returning to his chamber he sat during a period of 20 minutes, considering whether he should commit the murder or not. His heart relented when he remembered that his mistress had been so kind to him, but then he thought that there was no one in the house who could hear him, and he determined upon perpetrating the deed. Impelled by a feeling which he could not control, he rushed up the stairs as far as the first landing place, but there he tarried, and in his alarm returned to his bedroom. Again he felt determined upon the course which he had originally proposed, and again he had ascended the stairs on his way to his mistress's room, but once more he felt irresolute. To use his own expression, he had now determined not to commit the murder, but the devil was so busy within him that, in an agony of emotion, he was unable to prevail against an inward feeling which drove him again towards his lady's room. Once he retired, but once again he advanced, and he had now reached the door by which only he was separated from the object upon which he was about to commit the foul crime, of which in the sequel he was guilty. Had that door been locked, all would have been well, but no, the latch turned easily in his hand, and he stood within a yard of his victim. Still he could not kill her, and in trepidation and alarm he crept back as far as the stairhead. Again he felt the devil at work, and once more he was driven onwards to his fate. He entered the room a second time, and could distinctly hear the respirations of the unfortunate lady. He opened the curtains softly, and fancied he could see the outline of her figure. Had he had a light, he was convinced he could never have killed her. At length, however, urged by an irresistible impulse, he raised the cleaver, and yet hesitating, he made as many as 13 or 14 motions in the air before he could determine to strike her. But then he let the murderous instrument fall with redoubled force upon her head. The unhappy lady attempted to escape, but without effect, for he followed upon the frightful wound which he had first inflicted with others still more dreadful, until at last she sunk exhausted on the floor and died. The only words which he heard her utter were, "O Lord, what is this?" And when she died she rattled very much in the throat. He was so alarmed at this that he ran down the stairs and threw the chopper in the privy, and when he had returned to his own room, the thought struck him that he would rob the house. The idea had no sooner entered his head than he resolved to put it into execution, and, striking a light, he returned to his mistress's room. He took away some articles of jewellery from the drawers, but while he was occupied in finding them, he fancied that he heard the death rattle still in his lady's throat, and he would have given the world to have been able to recall what had passed. When he had purloined all that he thought was of any value, he ran out of the house, and as he passed through Holborn he heard the watchman cry past 1 o'clock, from which he knew that it was more than an hour since he had first contemplated the murder. He concealed the articles which he had stolen in the lodgings of a female of his acquaintance, and returned home, but on his arrival at the door he found that he had shut himself out. He waited until the maidservant came at 6 o'clock in the morning, and then on their entering the house, appearances were perceptible which induced the girl to suppose that there had been some strangers in the house. On her going upstairs she found that her mistress had been murdered, and she directly conveyed information of the circumstance to the police, when, Henderson being at once suspected, he was taken into custody and confessed his guilt. The sentence was carried out in its terms, and the body of the wretched young man, after execution, was hung in chains in the Edgware Road. Charles Ratcliffe, Esquire, executed for high treason. This gentleman was a party to the designs of the Jacobinical lords whose executions we have detailed, and was taken by the Seahorse frigate on his passage to Scotland to join the rebel forces. He had been concerned in the rebellion of 1715, and would then have been pardoned, but with 15 others he escaped out of Newgate and went to France. He afterwards lived in London, but was not molested, but subsequently again joining the design of the Pretender, and being seized, he was tried whether he was the same person who had been before convicted, and was found to be the same. He therefore received sentence of death, and was beheaded on Tower Hill on the 8th of December 1746. The prisoner was one of the brothers of the Earl of Derwentwater, who was executed in 1716, as before detailed, and they were the sons of Sir Francis Ratcliffe, by Lady Mary Tudor, natural daughter of Charles II, by Mrs. Mary Davis. Lord Lovat, beheaded for high treason. This lord, who in 1715 had been a supporter of the House of Hanover, in 1745 changed sides and became a friend of the party which he had before opposed. His career in life began in the year 1692, when he was appointed a captain in Lord Tullybardine's regiment, but he resigned his commission in order to prosecute his claim to be the chief of the Frasers, in order to effect which he laid a scheme to get possession of the heiress of Lovat, who was about to be married to a son of Lord Salton. He raised a clan, who violently seized the young lord, and, erecting a gibbet, showed it to him and his father, threatening their instant death unless they relinquished the contract made for the heiress of Lovat. To this, fearing for their lives, they consented, but still unable to get possession of the young lady, he seized the Dowager Lady Lovat in her own house, caused a priest to marry them against her consent, cut her stays open with his dirk, and, assisted by his ruffians, tore off her clothes, forced her into bed, to which he followed her, and then called his companions to witness the consummation of the outrageous marriage. For this breach of the peace he was indicted, but fled from justice, but he was nevertheless tried for rape, and for treason, in opposing the laws with an armed force, and sentence of outlawry was pronounced against him. Having fled to France, he turned Papist, ingratiated himself with the Pretender, and was rewarded by him with a commission. But he was apprehended on the remonstrance of the English ambassador in Paris, and lodged in the Bastille, where, having remained some years, he procured his liberty by taking priest's orders, under colour of which he became a Jesuit in the College of St. Omer's. In the first rebellion of 1715 he returned to Scotland, and joining the king's troops, assisted them in seizing Inverness from the rebels, for which service he got the title of Lovat, was appointed to command, and had other favours conferred upon him. In the rebellion of which we are now treating, he turned sides, and joined the Pretender, a step treacherous in the extreme. When taken, he was old, unwieldy, and almost helpless, although in that condition he had been possessed of infinite resources to assist the rebellion. He petitioned the Duke of Cumberland for mercy, and hoping to work upon his feelings, recapitulated his former services, the favours that he had received from the Duke's grandfather, King George I, and dwelt much upon his access to court, saying, he had carried him to whom he now sued for life in his arms, and when a baby held him up while his grandsire fondled upon him. On the 9th of March 1747, however, he was taken from the Tower to Westminster Hall for trial, and the evidence adduced clearly proving his guilt to be of no ordinary character, he was convicted. He was next day brought up for judgment, and sentence of death was pronounced. That this sentence was not ill-deserved appears from a speech of Lord Belhaven, delivered in the last Parliament held in Edinburgh in 1706, in which his lordship, speaking of this nobleman, then Captain Fraser, on occasion of the Scots plot, commonly called Fraser's plot, says, that he deserved, if practicable, to have been hanged 5 several times, in 5 different places, and upon 5 different accounts at least, as having been notoriously a traitor to the court of St. James's, a traitor to the court of St. Germain's, a traitor to the court of Versailles, and a traitor to his own country of Scotland, in being not only an avowed and restless enemy to the peace and quiet of its established government and constitution, both in church and state, but likewise a vile Proteus-like apostate, and a seducer of others in point of religion, as the tide or wind changed, and moreover that, abstracted from all those, his multiplied acts of treason abroad and at home, he deserved to be hanged as a condemned criminal, outlaw, and fugitive, for the barbarous, cruel, and most flagitious rape he had, with the assistance of some of his vile and abominable band of ruffians, violently committed on the body of a right honourable and virtuous lady, the widow of the late Lord Lovat, and sister of his Grace the late Duke of Athol. Nay, so hardened was Captain Fraser, that he audaciously erected a gallows, and threatened to hang thereon one of the said lady's brothers, and some other gentlemen of quality who accompanied him in going to rescue him out of that criminal's cruel hand. On the morning fixed for his execution, 9th of April 1747, Lord Lovat, who was now in his 80th year, and very large and unwieldy in his person, awoke at about 3 o'clock, and was heard to pray with great devotion. At 5 o'clock he arose and asked for a glass of wine and water, and at 8 o'clock he desired that his wig might be sent, that the barber might have time to comb it out genteelly, and then he provided himself with a purse to hold the money which he intended for the executioner. At about 9:30 o'clock he ate heartily of minced veal, and ordered that his friends might be provided with coffee and chocolate, and at 11 o'clock the sheriffs came to demand his body. He then requested his friends to retire while he said a short prayer, but he soon called them back and said that he was ready. At the bottom of the first pair of stairs, General Williamson invited him into his room to rest himself, which he did, and on his entrance paid his respects to the company politely, and talked freely. He desired of the General, in French, that he might take leave of his lady, and thank her for her civilities, but the General told his lordship in the same language that she was too much affected with his lordship's misfortunes to bear the shock of seeing him, and therefore hoped his lordship would excuse her. He then took his leave and proceeded. At the door he bowed to the spectators, and was conveyed from thence to the outer gate in the governor's coach, where he was delivered to the sheriffs, who conducted him in another coach to the house near the scaffold, in which was a room lined with black cloth, and hung with sconces, for his reception. His friends were at first denied entrance, but upon application made by his lordship to the sheriffs for their admittance, it was granted. Soon after, his lordship, addressing himself to the sheriffs, thanked them for the favour, and, taking a paper out of his pocket, delivered it to one of them, saying he should make no speech, and that they might give the word of command when they pleased. A gentleman present beginning to read a prayer to his lordship while he was sitting, he called one of the warders to help him up, that he might kneel. Then he prayed silently a short time, and afterwards sat again in his chair. Being asked by one of the sheriffs if he would refresh himself with a glass of wine, he declined it, because no warm water could be had to mix with it, and took a little burnt brandy and bitters in its stead. He requested that his clothes might be delivered to his friends with his corpse, and said for that reason he should give the executioner 10 guineas. He also desired of the sheriffs that his head might be received in a cloth and put into the coffin, which the sheriffs, after conferring with some gentlemen present, promised should be done, as also that the holding up the head at the corners of the scaffold should be dispensed with, as it had been of late years at the execution of lords. When his lordship was going up the stairs to the scaffold, assisted by 2 warders, he looked round, and seeing so great a concourse of people, "God save us," says he, "why should there be such a bustle about taking off an old grey head that cannot get up 3 steps without 3 bodies to support it?" Turning about, and observing one of his friends much dejected, he clapped him on the shoulder, saying, "Cheer up thy heart, man. I am not afraid. Why should you be so?" As soon as he came upon the scaffold, he asked for the executioner, and presented him with 10 guineas in a purse, and then, desiring to see the axe, he felt the edge, and said he believed it would do. Soon after he rose from the chair which was placed for him, and looked at the inscription on his coffin, and on sitting down again, he repeated from Horace, "Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori," and afterwards from Ovid, "Nam genus et proavos et quae non fecimus ipsi vix ea nostra voco." He then desired all the people to stand off except his 2 warders, who supported his lordship, while he said a prayer, after which he called his solicitor and agent in Scotland, Mr. W. Fraser, and, presenting his gold-headed cane, said, "I deliver you this cane in token of my sense of your faithful services, and of my committing to you all the power I have upon earth," and then embraced him. He also called for Mr. James Fraser, and said, "My dear James, I am going to heaven, but you must continue to crawl a little longer in this evil world." And, taking leave of both, he delivered his hat, wig, and clothes to Mr. William Fraser, desiring him to see that the executioner did not touch them. He ordered his cap to be put on, and, unloosing his neckcloth and the collar of his shirt, kneeled down at the block and pulled the cloth which was to receive his head close to him. But being placed too near the block, the executioner desired him to remove a little further back, which, with the warder's assistance, was immediately done, and his neck being properly placed, he told the executioner he would say a short prayer, and then give the signal by dropping his handkerchief. In this posture he remained about half a minute, and then throwing his handkerchief on the floor, the executioner at one blow cut off his head, which was received in the cloth, and with his body was put into the coffin, and carried in a hearse back to the Tower, where it was interred near the bodies of the other lords. His lordship professed himself a papist, and at his request was attended by Mr. Baker, attached to the chapel of the Sardinian ambassador, and though he insisted much on the services he had done the royal family in 1715, yet he declared, but a few days before his death, that he had been concerned in all the schemes formed for restoring the House of Stuart since he was 15 years old. This nobleman's intellectual powers seem to have been considerable, and his learning extensive. He spoke Latin, French, and English fluently, and other modern languages intelligibly. He studied at Aberdeen, and disputed his philosophy in Greek, and, though he was educated a Protestant, yet after 3 years' study of divinity and controversy he turned papist. He maintained an appearance of that facetious disposition for which he was remarkable to the last, and seems to have taken great pains to quit the stage, not only with decency, but with that dignity which is thought to distinguish the good conscience and noble mind. The following lines upon the execution of these noblemen are said to have been repeated with great energy by Dr. Johnson, although there appears to be no ground for supposing that they were the doctor's own composition. They first appeared in the Gentleman's Magazine. Pitied by gentle minds, Kilmarnock died. The brave Balmerino were on thy side. Part 17 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 17. Francis Townley, James Dawson, and others. Executed for high treason. These prisoners were parties to the same plot, and all of them held ranks in the Pretender's army. Dawson had paid addresses to a young lady, to whom he was to have been married immediately after his enlargement, if the solicitations that were made for his pardon had been attended with the desired effect. The circumstance of his love, and the melancholy that was produced by his death, are so admirably treated in the following ballad of Shenstone, that Dawson's story will probably be remembered and regretted when that of the rest of the rebels will be forgotten. Jemmy Dawson, a Ballad. Come listen to my mournful tale, ye tender hearts and lovers dear, nor will you scorn to heave a sigh, nor will you blush to shed a tear. And thou, dear Kitty, peerless maid, do thou a pensive ear incline, for canst thou weep at every woe, and pity every plaint but mine? Young Dawson was a gallant youth, a lighter never trod the plain, and well he loved one charming maid, and dearly was he loved again. One tender maid, she loved him dear, of gentle blood the damsel came, and faultless was her beauteous form, and spotless was her virgin frame. But curse on parties' hateful strife, that led the faithful youth astray. The day the rebel clans appeared, oh, had he never seen that day! Their colours and their sash he wore, and in their fatal dress was found, and now he must that death endure, which gives the brave the keenest wound. How pale was then his true love's cheek when Jemmy's sentence reached her ear, for never yet did alpine snows so pale nor yet so chill appear. Yet might sweet mercy find a place, and bring relief to Jemmy's woes. O George, without a prayer for thee, my orisons should never close. Thy gracious prince that gives him life would crown a never-dying flame, and every tender babe I bore should learn to lisp the giver's name. But though, dear youth, thou shouldst be dragged to yonder ignominious tree, thou shalt not want a faithful friend to share thy bitter fate with thee. Oh, then her mourning coach was called, the sledge moved slowly on before, though borne in a triumphal car, she had not loved her favourite more. She followed him, prepared to view the terrible behests of the law, and the last scene of Jemmy's woes with calm and steadfast eyes she saw. Distorted was that blooming face, which she had fondly loved so long, and stifled was that tuneful breath, which in her praise had sweetly sung. And severed was that beauteous neck, round which her arms had fondly closed, and mangled was that beauteous breast, on which her lovesick head reposed. And ravished was that constant heart, she did to every heart prefer, for though it could his king forget, 'twas true and loyal still to her. Amidst those unrelenting flames she bore this constant heart to see, but when 'twas mouldered into dust, yet she cried, I'll follow thee. My death, can only show the pure and lasting love I bore. Accept, O heaven, of woes like ours, and let us weep no more. The dismal scene was o'er and past, the lover's mournful hearse retired, the maid drew back her languid head, and sighing forth his name expired. Though justice ever must prevail, the tear my Kitty sheds is due, for seldom shall we hear a tale so sad, so tender, and so true. These offenders were hanged on Kennington Common. They had not hung above 5 minutes when Townley was cut down, being yet alive, and his body being placed on the block, the executioner chopped off his head with a cleaver. His heart and bowels were then taken out, and thrown into the fire, and the other parties being separately treated in the same manner, the executioner cried out, God save King George. The bodies were quartered and delivered to the keepers of the new jail, who buried them. The heads of some of the parties were sent to Carlisle and Manchester, where they were exposed, but those of Townley and another were fixed on Temple Bar, and after remaining some time fell down. It would be useless to attempt to enumerate the other persons whose crimes and misfortunes at this time consigned them to the gibbet, but some account of the escape of the Pretender may not be uninteresting. It would appear that the Battle of Culloden having decided the fate of his cause, where the Pretender had his horse shot under him by one of the King's troopers as he was endeavouring to rally his soldiers, he retired to the house of a factor of Lord Lovat, at about 10 miles from Inverness, where he met with that lord and supped with him. After supper he started on his journey to Fort Augustus, and next day went to Invergarry. A boy whom he found there caught him a salmon, and he dined, and afterwards waited for some of his troops, who had promised to meet him there. Being disappointed, however, in his object, he proceeded to Lochharciage, and he arrived there on the 18th of April, at about 2 in the morning, and slept, but at 5 he set out on foot and travelled through the glen of Morar, where he arrived at 4 the next morning. He reached Arrashag in 12 hours after, and was there joined by Captain O'Neill on the 27th, who informed him that his cause was hopeless, and recommended him therefore to sail at once for France. One Donald MacLeod was engaged to hire a ship, and on the 28th the Chevalier went on board an 8-oared boat in company with Sullivan and O'Neill, ordering the people who belonged to that boat to make the best haste they could to Stornoway, where it was proposed they should take a ship. The night proving very tempestuous, they all begged him to go back, which he would not do, but to keep up the spirits of the people he sang them a Highland song. The weather growing worse and worse, about 7 in the morning of the 29th they were driven on shore, on a point of land called Rushness, in the island of Benbecula, where, when they got on shore, the Pretender helped to make a fire to warm the crew, who were almost starved to death with cold. On the 30th, at 6 in the evening, they set sail again for Stornoway, but meeting with another storm, were obliged to put into the island of Scalpa, in the Harris, where they all went on shore to a farmer's house, passing for merchants, that were shipwrecked in their voyage to the Orkneys, the Pretender and Sullivan going by the name of Sinclair, the latter passing for the father, and the former for his son. They thought proper to send from thence to Stornoway, with instructions to freight a ship for the Orkneys, and on the 3rd of May they received a message that a ship was ready. On the 4th they set out for that place, where they arrived on the 5th about noon, but meeting with their messenger Donald MacLeod, they found that he had got into company, and told a friend of his for whom he had hired the ship, upon which there were 200 people in arms at Stornoway, upon a report that the Pretender was landed with 500 men, and was coming to burn the town, so that they were obliged to lie all night upon the moor, with no other refreshment than biscuit and brandy. On the 6th they resolved to go in the 8-oared boat to the Orkneys, but the crew refused to venture, so that they were obliged to steer south along the coast side, where they met with 2 English ships, and this compelled them to put into a desert island, where they remained till the 10th, without any provision but some salt fish they found upon the place. About 10 in the morning of that day they embarked for the Harris, and at break of day on the 11th they were chased by an English vessel, but made their escape among the rocks. About 4 in the afternoon they arrived on the island of Benbecula, where they remained till the 14th, and then they set out for the mountain of Currada in South Uist, where they stayed till the militia of the Isle of Skye came to the island of Iraski. They now sailed for the island of Uia, where they remained 3 nights, till, having intelligence that the militia were coming toward Benbecula, they immediately got into their boat and sailed for Loch Busdale. Being met, however, by some ships of war, they were obliged to return to Loch Nagar, and at night sailed for Loch Busdale, upon arriving at which place they stayed 8 days on a rock, making a tent of the sail of the boat. They found themselves here in a most dreadful situation, for having intelligence that Captain Scott had landed in Kirlbride, they were obliged to separate, and the Pretender and O'Neill went to the mountains, where they remained all night, and soon after were informed that General Campbell was at Benary, so that now they had forces very near on both sides of them, and were absolutely at a loss which way to move. In their road they met with a young lady, one Miss MacDonald, to whom Captain O'Neill proposed assisting the Pretender to make his escape, which at first she refused, but upon his offering to put on women's clothes she consented, and desired them to go to the mountain of Currada till she sent for them. They accordingly there stayed 2 days, but hearing nothing from the young lady, the Pretender concluded she would not keep her word, and therefore resolved to send Captain O'Neill to General Campbell, to let him know he was willing to surrender to him. But about 5 o'clock in the evening a message came from the young lady, desiring them to meet her at Rushness. Being afraid to pass by the ford because of the militia, they luckily found a boat which carried them to the other side of Uia, where they remained part of the next day, afraid of being seen by the country people. In the evening they set out for Rushness, and arrived there at 12 at night, but not finding the young lady, and being alarmed by a boat full of militia, were obliged to retire 2 miles back, where the Pretender remained on a moor till O'Neill went to the young lady, and prevailed upon her to come to the place appointed at nightfall of the next day. About an hour after, they had an account of General Campbell's arrival at Benbecula, which obliged them to move to another part of the island, where, as the day broke, they discovered 4 sail close on the shore, making directly up to the place where they were, so that there was nothing left for them but to throw themselves among the heath. When the wherries were gone, they resolved to go to Clanronald's house, but when they were within a mile of it, they heard General Campbell was there, which forced them to retreat again. The young Pretender, having at length, with the assistance of Captain O'Neill, found Miss Macdonald in a cottage near the place appointed, it was there determined that he should put on women's clothes and pass for her waiting maid. This being done, he took leave of Sullivan and O'Neill with great regret, who departed to shift for themselves, leaving him and his new mistress at the cottage, where they continued some days, during which she cured him of the itch. Upon intelligence that General Campbell was gone further into the country, they removed to her cousin's and spent the night in preparing for the departure to the Isle of Skye, and they set out the next morning for that place with only 1 manservant, named Maclean, and 2 rowers. During their voyage they were pursued by a small vessel, but a thick fog rising, they arrived safe at midnight in that island, and landed at the foot of a rock, where the lady and her maid waited, while her man Maclean went to see if Sir Alexander MacDonald was at home. Maclean found his way thither, but lost it in returning, and his mistress and her maid, after in vain expecting him the whole night, were obliged in the morning to leave the rock, and to go in the boat up the creek to some distance, to avoid the militia, which guarded the coast. They went on shore again about 10 o'clock, and, attended by the rowers, inquired the way to Sir Alexander's. When they had gone about 2 miles, they met Maclean, and he told his lady that Sir Alexander was with the Duke of Cumberland, but his lady was at home, and would do them all the service she could. They then immediately discharged their boat, and went directly to the house, where they remained 2 days, being always in her ladyship's chamber, except at night, to prevent a discovery. But a party of the Macleods, having intelligence that some strangers were arrived at Sir Alexander's, and knowing his lady to be well affected to the Pretender, came thither, and demanding to see the newcomers, were introduced to Mrs. Chambers, where she sat with her new maid. The latter, hearing the militia were at the door, had the presence of mind to get up and open it, which occasioned his being the less noticed, and after they had narrowly searched the chests they withdrew. The inquiry, however, alarmed the young lady, and the next day she sent her apparent maid to a steward of Sir Alexander's, but hearing that his being in the island was known, he removed to Macdonald's at Kingsborough, 10 miles distant, where he remained but 1 day. For, on receiving intelligence that it was rumoured that he was disguised in a woman's habit, Macdonald furnished him with a suit of his own clothes, and he went in a boat to Macleod's at Raza. No prospect of escaping to France, however, presented itself there, and he returned to the Isle of Skye, being 30 miles, with no attendant but a ferryman, Macleod assuring him that the elder Laird of Mackinnon would there render him all the service in his power. On his reaching Mackinnon's, the old man instantly knew him, and advised him to go to Lochaber, and he accordingly proceeded thither in a vessel procured for that purpose. Macdonald, at the head of 100 resolute Highlanders, then appeared to assist him, and after roving about with them from place to place, he at length removed to Badenoch. He was there very much harassed by the king's troops, and losing many of his men in the skirmishes which daily took place, they were at length obliged to disperse, and the Pretender, with Lochiel of Barrisdale and some others, skulked about in Moidart. Here they received information that 2 French privateers were at anchor in Loch Nanor, in one of which, L'Heureux, this unfortunate prince eventually embarked, with 23 gentlemen and 107 soldiers, and soon after arrived safely in France. William York, aged 10 years, convicted of murdering Susan Mayhew, aged 5 years. This unhappy child, was but 10 years of age when he committed the dreadful crime of which he was convicted. He was a pauper in the poorhouse belonging to the parish of Eye in Suffolk, and was committed on the coroner's inquest to Ipswich jail for the murder of Susan Mayhew, another child of 5 years of age who had been his bedfellow. The following is his confession taken by a justice of the peace, and which was in part proved on the trial, with many corroborating circumstances of his guilt. He said that a trifling quarrel happening between them on the 13th of May 1748, about 10 in the morning, he struck her with his open hand, and made her cry. That she going out of the house to the dunghill opposite to the door, he followed her, with a hook in his hand, with an intent to kill her. But before he came up to her, he set down the hook, and went into the house for a knife. He then came out again, took hold of the girl's left hand, and cut her wrist all round to the bone, and then threw her down, and cut her to the bone just above the elbow of the same arm. That, after this, he had set his foot upon her stomach, and cut her right arm about, and to the bone, both on the wrist and above the elbow. That he still thought she would not die, and therefore took the hook, and cut her left thigh to the bone. His next care was to conceal the murder, for which purpose he filled a pail with water at a ditch, and washing the blood off the child's body, buried. Part 18 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Captain Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Benjamin Tapner, John Cobby, John Hammond, Richard Mills the Younger, and others. Executed for murder. We do not recollect ever to have heard of a case exhibiting greater brutality on the part of the murderers towards their victim than this. The offenders were all smugglers, and the unfortunate objects of their crime were a custom-house officer and a shoemaker, named respectively William Galley and Daniel Chater. It would appear that a daring and very extensive robbery having been committed at the custom-house at Poole, Galley and Chater were sent to Stansted in Sussex to give some information to Major Battine, a magistrate, in reference to the circumstance. They did not, however, return to their homes, and on inquiry it turned out that they had been brutally murdered, the body of Galley being traced by means of bloodhounds to be buried, while that of Chater was discovered at a distance of 6 miles in a well in Harris's Wood, near Lee, in Lady Holt's Park, covered up with a quantity of stones, wooden railings, and earth. At a special commission held in Chichester on the 16th of January 1749, the prisoners Benjamin Tapner, John Cobby, John Hammond, William Carter, Richard Mills the Elder, and Richard Mills the Younger were indicted for the murder of Daniel Chater, the 3 first as principals, and the others as accessories before the fact, and William Jackson and William Carter were indicted for the murder of William Galley. From the evidence adduced, the circumstances of this most horrid murder were proved, and it appeared that the 2 deceased persons, having passed Havant on their road to Stansted, went to the New Inn at Lee, where they met one Austin and his brother and brother-in-law, of whom they asked the road, and they conducted them to Rowland's Castle, where they said they might obtain better information. They went into the White Hart, and Mrs. Payne, the landlady, suspecting the object of their mission, sent for the prisoners Jackson and Carter, and they were soon after joined by some others of the gang. After they had all been sitting together, Carter and Chater called out and demanded to know where Diamond, one of those suspected of the robbery, was. Chater replied that he was in custody, and that he was going against his will to give evidence against him. Galley, following them into the yard, was knocked down by Carter on his calling Chater away, and they then returned indoors. The smugglers now pretended to be sorry for what had occurred, and desired Galley to drink some rum, and they persisted in plying him and Chater with liquor until they were both intoxicated. They were then persuaded to lie down and sleep, and a letter to Major Battine, of which they were the bearers, was taken from them, read, and destroyed. One John Royce, a smuggler, now came in, and Jackson and Carter told him the contents of the letter, and said that they had got the old rogue, the shoemaker of Fordingbridge, who was going to inform against John Diamond, the shepherd, then in custody at Chichester. Here William Steele proposed to take them both to a well about 200 yards from the house, and to murder and throw them in. But this was rejected, and after several propositions had been made as to the mode in which they should be disposed of, the scene of cruelty was commenced by Jackson, who, putting on his spurs, jumped upon the bed where they lay, and spurred their foreheads, and whipped them, so that they both got up bleeding. The smugglers then took them out of the house, and Mills swore he would shoot any one who followed or said anything of what had occurred. Meanwhile the rest put Galley and Chater on one horse, tied their legs under the horse's belly, and then tied the legs of both together. They now set forward, with the exception of Royce, who had no horse, and they had not gone above 200 yards before Jackson called out, "Whip 'em, cut 'em, slash 'em, damn 'em," upon which all began to whip except Steele, who led the horse, the roads being very bad. They whipped them for half a mile till they came to Woodash, where they fell off, with their heads under the horse's belly, and their legs, which were tied, appeared over the horse's back. Their tormentors soon set them upright again, and continued whipping them over the head, face, shoulders, etc., till they came to Dean, upwards of half a mile farther, and here they both fell again as before, with their heads under the horse's belly, which was struck at every step by the horse's hoofs. Upon placing them again in the saddle, the villains found them so weak that they could not sit, upon which they separated them, and put Galley before Steele, and Chater before Little Sam, and then whipped Galley so severely that, the lashes coming upon Steele at his desire, they desisted. They then went to Harris's well, and threatened to throw Galley in. But when he desired that they would put an end to his misery at once, "No," said Jackson, "if that's the case we have something more to say to you." And they thereupon put him on the horse again, and whipped him over the downs until he was so weak that he fell off. They next laid him across the horse, and Little Sam, getting up behind him, subjected him to such cruelty as made him groan with the most excruciating torments, and he fell off again. Being again put up astride, Richards got up behind him, but the poor man soon cried out, "I fall, I fall," and Richards pushed him with a force, saying, "Fall and be damned." The unhappy man then turned over and expired, and they threw the body over the horse and carried it off with them to the house of one Scardifield, who kept the Red Lion at Rake. The landlord remarking the condition of Chater and Galley's body, the fellows told him that they had engaged with some officers, had lost their tea, and that some of them were wounded, if not dead. This was sufficient, and Jackson and Carter carried Chater down to the house of the elder Mills, where they chained him up in a turf house. Their companions in the meantime drank gin and brandy at Scardifield's, and it now being nearly dark, they borrowed spades and a candle and lantern, and making him assist them in digging a hole, they buried the body of the murdered officer. They then separated, but on the Thursday they met again with some more of their associates, including the prisoners Richard Mills and his two sons Richard and John, Thomas Stringer, Cobby, Tapner and Hammond, for the purpose of deliberating what should be done with their prisoner. It was soon unanimously resolved that he must be destroyed, and it was determined that they should take him to Harris's well and throw him in, as it was considered that the death would be most likely to cause him the greatest pain. During this time the wretched man was in a state of the utmost horror and misery, being visited occasionally by all his tormentors, who abused him and beat him violently. At last, when this determination had been arrived at, they all went, and Tapner, pulling out a clasp knife, ordered him on his knees, swearing that he would be his butcher, but being dissuaded from this, as being opposed to their plan to prolong the miseries of their prisoner, he contented himself with slashing the knife across his eyes, almost cutting them out, and completely severing the gristle of his nose. They then placed him upon a horse, and all set out together for Harris's well, except Mills and his sons, they having no horses ready, and saying in excuse that there were enough without them to murder one man. All the way Tapner whipped him till the blood came, and then swore that if he bloodied the saddle he would torture him the more. When they were come within 100 yards of the well, Jackson and Carter stopped, saying to Tapner, Cobby, Stringer, Steele and Hammond, "Go on and do your duty on Chater, as we have ours upon Galley." It was in the dead of the night that they brought their victim to the well, which was nearly 30 feet deep, but dry, and paled close round, and Tapner having fastened a noose around his neck, they bade him get over the pails. He was going through a broken place, but though he was covered with blood and fainting with anguish of his wounds, they forced him to climb up, having the rope about his neck. They then tied one end of the cord to the pails and pushed him over the brink, but the rope being short, he hung no farther within it than his thighs, and leaning against the edge, he hung above a quarter of an hour and was not strangled. They then untied him and threw him head foremost into the well. They tarried some time, and hearing him groan, they determined to go to one William Comleys, a gardener, to borrow a rope and ladder, saying they wanted to relieve one of their companions who had fallen into Harris's well. He said they might take them, but they could not manage the ladder in their confusion, it being a long one. They then returned to the well, and still hearing him groan, and fearful that the sound might lead to a discovery, the place being near the road, they threw upon him some of the rails and gateposts fixed about the well as some great stones, and then finding him silent they left him. Their next consultation was how to dispose of their horses, and they killed Galley's, which was grey, and taking his hide off, cut it into small pieces and hid them so as to prevent any discovery, but a bay horse that Chater had ridden on got from them. This being the evidence produced, the jury, after being out of court about a quarter of an hour, brought in a verdict of guilty against all the prisoners, whereupon the judge pronounced sentence on the convicts in the most pathetic address, representing the enormity of their crime, and exhorting them to make immediate preparation for the awful fate that awaited them, adding, "Christian charity obliges me to tell you that your time in this world will be very short." The heinousness of this crime, of which these men had been convicted, rendering it necessary that their punishment should be exemplary, the judge ordered that they should be executed on the following day, and the sentence was accordingly carried into execution against all but Jackson, who died in prison on the evening that he was condemned. They were attended by 2 ministers, and all, except Mills and his son, who took no notice of each other, and thought themselves not guilty because they were not present at the finishing of the inhuman murder, showed great marks of penitence. Tapner and Carter gave good advice to the spectators, and desired diligence might be used to apprehend Richards, whom they charged as the cause of their being brought to this wretched end. Young Mills smiled several times at the executioner, who was a discharged marine, and having ropes too short for some of them, was puzzled to fit them. Old Mills, being forced to stand tiptoe to reach the halter, desired that he might not be hanged by inches. The 2 Mills were so rejoiced at being told that they were not to be hanged in chains after execution, that death seemed to excite them in no terror, while Jackson was so struck with horror at being measured for his irons that he soon expired. They were hanged at Chichester on the 18th of January 1749, amidst such a concourse of spectators as is seldom seen on the occasion of a public execution. Carter was hung in chains near Rake in Sussex, Tapner on Rook's Hill near Chichester, and Cobby and Hammond at Selsey Isle, on the beach where they sometimes landed their smuggled goods, and where they could be seen at a great distance east and west. Samuel Couchman and John Morgan, Lieutenant of Marines, Thomas Knight, carpenter, and others. Shot for mutiny. The Chesterfield man-of-war, under the command of Captain O'Brien Dudley, was stationed off Cape Coast Castle, on the coast of Africa, when a dangerous mutiny broke out among the crew, of whom the above-named officers were the leaders. They were charged on their trial with exciting and encouraging mutiny, and running away with His Majesty's ship Chesterfield on the 10th day of October 1748 from the coast of Africa, leaving their captain, 2 lieutenants with other officers, and some seamen on shore. It appeared from the evidence adduced before the court-martial by which the prisoners were tried, and which was presided over by Sir Edward Hawke, that on the 15th of October 1748, Captain Dudley, being on shore at Cape Coast Castle, sent off his barge to Lieutenant Couchman, ordering him to send the cutter with the boatswain of the ship to see the tents struck, and to bring everything belonging to the ship on board that night. Couchman, however, directly ordered the barge to be hoisted in, and the boatswain to turn all hands on the quarter-deck, and then coming from his cabin with a drawn sword, said, "Here I am, God damn me, and I will stand by you while I have a drop of blood in my body." He was accompanied by John Morgan, the second lieutenant of Marines, Thomas Knight the carpenter, his mate John Place, a principal actor, and about 30 seamen with cutlasses. They gave 3 huzzas and threw their hats overboard, damning old hats, and saying that they would soon get new. Couchman now sent for the boatswain to know if he would stand by him and go with him, but he replied no, and said, "For God's sake, sir, be ruled by reason, and consider what you are about." Couchman threatened to put him in irons if he did not join in with him, but the boatswain told him he never would be in such piratical designs, and he was immediately ordered into custody, and 2 sentinels put over him. Couchman soon after sent for Gillam, the mate of the ship, but he also refusing to join him was put into custody with 5 or 6 others. They were confined, however, only 5 or 6 hours, for in the middle of the night after their confinement, Couchman sent for them into the great cabin, desired them to sit and drink punch, and then dismissed them. The next day the boatswain was invited to dinner by the new commander, who began to rail against Captain Dudley, and proposed to him to sign a paper. He refused indignantly, and was immediately dismissed. When he quitted the great cabin he went to the gunner, who informed him that he had 20 pistols still at his disposal, and it was determined that an effort should be made that night to recover the ship from the mutineers. When evening drew on, the boatswain proceeded to sound the ship's company, and he soon found about 30 of the seamen, besides the mates, gunner's mates, and coxswain of the barge, ready to aid him. The boatswain took the command on himself, and the first step which he took was to get all the irons or bilboes on the forecastle. He then sent for the 20 pistols, which were all loaded. He next ordered 3 men upon the grand magazine, and 2 to the abaft, and the remainder, who had no pistols, to stay by the bilboes, and secure as many prisoners as he should send. This disposition being made, he went directly down on the deck, where he divided his small company into 2 parties, and one going down the main, and the other the fore hatchway. They soon secured 11 or 12 of the ringleaders, and sent them up to the forecastle without the least noise. The 2 parties then joined and went directly to the great cabin, where they secured Couchman and Morgan with the carpenter, whom they immediately confined in different parts of the vessel. The ship being thus secured, the captain again boarded her, and took the command of her, and on her return to England the mutineers were brought to trial. The court-martial having found them guilty of the crimes imputed to them, they were shot in the month of June 1749. The boatswain, Roger Winkett, was afterwards rewarded with £300 a year as master attendant of Woolwich Dockyard. John Mills executed for murder. The case of this felon becomes remarkable from the fact of the criminal being the son of Richard Mills the elder, whose ignominious fate we have just recorded. It appears that he was engaged in the robbery of the custom house, but escaped, and soon after his father, brother, and their accomplices were hanged, he thought of going to Bristol, with a view of embarking for France, and having hinted his intentions to some others, they resolved to accompany him. Stopping at a house on the road, they met with one Richard Hawkins, whom they asked to go with them, but the poor fellow hesitating, they put him on horseback behind Mills, and carried him to the Dog and Partridge, on Slendon Common, which was kept by John Reynolds. They had not been long in the house when complaint was made that 2 bags of tea had been stolen, and Hawkins was charged with the robbery. He steadily denied any knowledge of the affair, but they obliged him to pull off his clothes, and having stripped themselves they began to whip him with the most unrelenting barbarity. And Curtis, one of the gang, said he did know of the robbery, and if he did not confess he would whip him till he did, for he had whipped many a rogue, and washed his hands in his blood. The villains continued whipping the poor wretch till their breath was almost exhausted, when at length the unfortunate man mentioned something of his father and brother, on which Mills and Curtis said they would go and fetch them, but Hawkins expired soon after they had left the house. On their way back they met Winter, one of their companions, who informed them of this fact, when they dismissed the men whom they had compelled to accompany them, saying that they should be sent for when they were wanted. Their next anxiety was as to the mode in which they should dispose of the body, and it was proposed to throw it into a well in an adjacent park. But this being objected to, they carried it 12 miles, and having tied stones to it in order to sink it, they threw it into a pond in Parham Park, belonging to Sir Cecil Bishop, and in this place it lay more than 2 months before it was discovered. Mills was afterwards taken into custody on the information of Pring, an outlawed smuggler, and, being tried, was convicted. The country being at that time filled with smugglers, a rescue was feared, wherefore he was conducted to the place of execution by a guard of soldiers. When there he prayed with the clergyman, confessed that he had led a bad life, acknowledged the murder of Hawkins, desired that all young people would take warning by his untimely end, and humbly implored the forgiveness of God. He was executed on Slendon Common on the 12th of August 1749, and afterwards hung in chains on the same spot. Amy Hutchinson, burnt for the murder of her husband. This malefactor was born of indigent parents in the Isle of Ely, and having received a poor education, at the age of 16 she attracted the attention of a young man, whose love she returned with equal affection. A father, being apprised of the connection, strictly charged his daughter to decline it, but there was no arguing against love. The intimacy continued till it became criminal. The young fellow having soon grown tired of her, he went off to London, and she determined to revenge herself upon him for his infidelity, by marrying another suitor named John Hutchinson, who had previously been disagreeable to her. The marriage accordingly took place, but her first admirer happening to return from London just as the newly wedded pair were coming out of church, the bride was greatly affected at the recollection of former scenes, and the irrevocable ceremony which had now passed. Unable to love the man she had married, she doted to distraction on him she had lost, and only a few days after her marriage admitted him to his former intimacy with her. Hutchinson becoming jealous of his wife, a quarrel ensued, in consequence of which he beat her with great severity, but this producing no alteration in her conduct, he had recourse to drinking, with a view to avoid the pain of reflection on his situation. In the interim, his wife and the young fellow continued their guilty intercourse uninterrupted, but, considering the life of her husband as a bar to their happiness, it was resolved to remove him by poison. For this purpose the wife purchased a quantity of arsenic, and Mr. Hutchinson being afflicted with an ague, and wishing for something warm to drink, she put some arsenic in ale, of which he drank very plentifully, and then she left him, saying she would go and buy something for his dinner. Meeting her lover, she acquainted him with what had passed, on which he advised her